Hello everyone, and welcome to an Accelerant webinar, The Art of Forecasting, a Practical Approach. My name is Joanne Brunn, and I'm the Executive Vice President at Accelerant, and I'll be conducting the webinar today. We are thrilled to have Dan Brent, who's a CPA and the Associate Vice President of Finance from the Massachusetts School of Professional Psychology, with us today on this webinar to talk about his practical experience with forecasting. So we hope you enjoy the conversation and find some insights and practices that you can apply in your own institution. So before we begin, I'd like to just address some housekeeping points. First, just make sure you're viewing the presentation in full screen mode, and you can do that by maximizing your screen using the icon in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, or by using the controls on the bottom right corner of your GoToMeeting screen. And second, everyone on the call is muted, so if you'd like to ask a question anytime during the presentation, just click on the question box on your GoToWebinar panel and enter it via your keyboard. And I'll be collecting questions throughout the presentation, and we'll answer as many as we can at the end, time permitting. And so if we don't have time to answer your question on the call today, we will certainly follow up with you and make sure that you get the answers that you're looking for. Okay, so here's the agenda for today's webinar. We'll start off with the introductions. Then Dan will provide background information on the economic issues that are currently impacting his forecasts. Then we'll move into the top challenges of a forecasting process and what set Dan on the course of creating a forecasting solution initiative. Then he'll discuss how forecasting works today in his organization and the top benefits that he and others in his organization have achieved. And then finally, we'll end with some thought-provoking questions for you to ask yourself as you consider how to manage your own forecasting process. And again, at the end of the webinar, if there's time, we'll address some questions that you have posted online, and hopefully we'll get to all of those before we have to stop in about an hour. So who are we? Accelerant's a cloud-based software company that builds and implements innovative, practical, and incredibly powerful budget preparation, forecasting, and management reporting software. So our goal is to energize what we call a culture of budget accountability with those people who are preparing the budget, while also providing finance with the controls to manage the process. So all of us at Accelerant are thrilled that one of our clients, Dan Brent, is here with us today to share a practical application of the forecasting process at his school. So Dan, would you please introduce yourself, describe your background, your role in the organization, and give us an overview of your organization's mission and the population that it serves.
Thanks, Joanne. My name is Dan Brent. I'm the Associate Vice President of Finance at the Massachusetts School of Professional Psychology. I've been with the college for almost 4 years, and before that spent 7 years with a national public accounting firm, and I'm also a CPA. MSPP is a private, nonprofit graduate school of psychology. We're located in Newton, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Boston. We have 14 degree programs, including doctorate and master's degrees, and our programs range from 1 to 4 years in length. MSPP has grown significantly over the last 10 years. More recently, over the last 5 years, our budget has doubled from $9 million to $21 million, and our students have more than doubled up to about 650 currently.
Okay, thanks, Dan. And I think that one of the things that we'll probably get into a bit is why your budget has increased the way it has. It's quite a significant increase.
Yes, we'll get into that.
Okay, so if we could just first start off with describe the difference as you see it between budgeting and forecasting.
Budgeting is the process of planning in advance for the next fiscal year. At MSPP, we're a May 31st year end, and we start our budget process in the fall prior to that fiscal year. So it usually starts in October. We have our budget meetings in November. We start putting the budget together in December, and then we go to the Finance Committee and ultimately the board in January to get it approved. But what happens between January and then when the fiscal year starts in June, and then ultimately when enrollment comes in September, many things can change, and that's when we start getting into a forecast.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just as a clarification point, because I know that a lot of our clients and a lot of people that we talk to don't actually do budgets on a monthly basis. They're really just, if they can get them at all, they're happy to get them on an annual basis. So one of the things we talked about here on the screen, that budgets are 12 to 18 months ahead of the fiscal year. So you're actually doing your budget on a monthly basis and your forecast on a monthly basis. Is that correct?
That's correct. So at any given time, we're actually working on the current year budget, oftentimes looking at the next fiscal year budget, but also working on a forecast. So like I said, once we know what enrollment is in September, that's what kind of flips the switch, and we're starting to not only monitor the budget, but look at what the forecasted bottom line is going to be at the end of that fiscal year.
Mm-hmm. So they actually overlap for about 6 months or 9 months that you're working on both at the same time?
That's right, yeah, and the reason for that is 40% of our revenue actually comes from our incoming class. So oftentimes we don't know what our incoming class is going to be. We don't know what the mix between the programs, and we don't know how many faculty we're going to hire. So oftentimes we budget for certain enrollment targets, but the actual is oftentimes much different.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And we've talked about the reasons why forecasting is critical for your organization, and we've listed some here. And obviously, some of these are can be associated with any types of organization. So if you could just talk about why you think forecasting is critical for any organization, and talk about some specifics in your situation.
Yeah. So I'm sure in some cases, your institution, you have a budget. And it doesn't change much during the year. You have consistent growth. But for our school, with all the changes, we need to have a forecasting process in place during the year to monitor the progress of that budget, of that forecast year. And recently, we moved from a small location into Newton, where we have a lease with an option to purchase. And we use tax-exempt financing to renovate the building. So now we're subject to bank covenants. We really have to look at what the bottom line is going to be throughout the year and plan ahead for that building purchase.
I think the other thing you mentioned in terms of rapid growth, that you have, I can't remember how many more new programs this year or in the last years over years past, and that's also accounting for the forecasting being such an important piece of your process.
Yeah, that's a great point. We in 2002, we actually only had one program at the time. It was our clinical psychology doctorate program, and that's all we had. And since then, we've added several master's programs, and a few of those are online. Some of them have blended curriculum. They have different pricing structures. The number of credits taken per year varies by program. So there's so many different factors going into the budget planning process, and ultimately that's where you have to flip the switch to a forecast at some point, because the budget isn't going to be completely accurate.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that, about the economic impacts. And obviously you're talking about it from your specific situation, but people can extrapolate in terms of, new product development, new hires and growth in other industries. So if you could talk about the kind of the economic impacts of the 4 points on there, and how you're dealing with that, and why that's important for you to even worry about in terms of a forecast.
Yeah, the first obviously is student enrollment. Actually, when the economy is in a downtime, graduate school actually it sort of picks up, because there's not many jobs out there. Students decide to go back to school. So student enrollment is always one of the biggest factors. Fundraising revenue is another part of our business that's contingent on what the economy is. There's been a lot of scrutiny out there about student debt, and the student interest rates are pretty high right now when compared to mortgage rates. And at graduate schools, there's no subsidized student loans anymore, so these students are accruing interest rate up front, and the rates are generally close to 6% range. And with all the scrutiny about the student debt, we actually have students and parents of students asking questions about how much debt are we going to have when we graduate? How much money are we going to make when we graduate? Are there jobs out there? can we pay back our student loans? So really the economy has kind of dictated a lot of that student debt information.
Mm-hmm. And I think one of the other things that you had mentioned in terms of the student loan interest rates, that you have to maintain a particular, actually let's move to this piece, about why there's more scrutiny and pressure. One of the things that I found really interesting, maybe you could go into a bit, about managing the student default rate, that there's so many moving pieces and variables that if you're not in control of all of them throughout the year, that they could have very detrimental effects on your ability to attract new students.
Right, yeah, that's really something the Department of Education is trying to crack down on. And we're measured, so when a student leaves the school, either graduates, withdraws, they have 6 months that they don't have to make any payments, and after that, that's when the payments kick in. And they measure 2 years from that and 3 years, 2 different ratios, and they take the denominator, and then they find out how many people are in default, and that's your student loan default rate. And ours currently is at 0%, which is pretty amazing considering some of these students are graduating with $150,000 to $200,000 of student debt after 4 years here.
Yeah, that is something. So if you could talk a little bit about why there's more scrutiny and pressure, and particularly if you've noticed have there been changes with these 6 points sort of over the years that you've been in the university arena?
Yeah, so obviously the first one is the fact that we moved to this new building. We use tax-exempt financing to renovate. Now we have debt covenants. We have to make a certain bottom line, and we have to monitor that during the year. And the other piece of it is, our customers, our students are actually much more savvy than they used to, and they, you really have to kind of watch, do we really need that expense? Because, students are borrowing to pay for whatever we spend here. So we do get involved with some of the student governing committees here and talk about the budget. So you have to watch it from both angles, the banks, the students, and of course the board you have to report to as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then you have that other piece, your option to purchase leased building, which is a new piece in your whole budget and forecasting process of whether that's even a viable option for you or not.
Yeah, so there's also some pressure to save as much money as possible to bank money for the building purchase, and we have meetings all the time with trustees trying to get a capital campaign going, raise as much money from fundraising, but also generate profits from operations to plan for that building purchase, and we generally do a 3-year plan during the budget process as well.
Okay, so let's move on and talk about some of the details. So who is participating in the actual forecasting process? So let's talk first about your managers. What do you expect from them, or certain of them or all of them, during the forecasting process?
Yeah, so when the forecasting process, as I mentioned, doesn't start until after we know what enrollment is, or after we've hired all our faculty, the faculty contracts are out, we know what the benefits are going to be during the year. And on the academic side, there's really not much to monitor because payroll is pretty fixed after that point, but we do have to monitor attrition, and we certainly forecast for a percentage of our students to leave the school, and we keep track of that regularly to make sure that our tuition revenue numbers aren't going to be off too much during the year. And we also have some fees for service revenue that we're continually asking our continuing education program and some of our other alternative revenue sources how much they expect to have at the end of the year, and also from fundraising. And then on the expense side, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You finish.
Okay. And on the expense side, we regularly meet with several department heads to look at the original budget, see what their actuals are to date, and then forecast what that number is going to be at the end of the year as things change throughout the year.
Okay. What I was just going to add was I thought it was very interesting that you don't just focus on the quantitative aspects of the forecast, but also the qualitative. So the first expectation of managers that we talked about, that you mentioned to me, was getting and keeping the students in the door. And so it's not necessarily directly quantitative, but it does have a tremendous impact on your budget and forecast.
Yeah, I mean, that's retention's pretty important, and we actually use some of that data that we generate from the system to have an attrition review once a year to see, why did students leave, how much money did that cost us, not only for this fiscal year, but as you know, it continues on if they were supposed to be here for, 3 or 4 more years.
Okay. So you told me that you focus on the variables which typically impact the major spenders. So, and you mentioned these 4 departments. So why those 4 departments, and what are the variables that you're focused on?
Yeah, so we do send reports to all of our department heads, after each forecast to sort of monitor the progress. But the main spenders are those 4 departments: marketing, IT, plant maintenance, and library. Those are where the significant variables are in. Sometimes we allocate more dollars to advertising than the budget, asked for, depending on the fiscal year we're having. There's always things that come up in IT that, we have to spend this. I know it maybe wasn't part of our original plan, but now we have to spend this money. Plant maintenance is an unknown based on, repairs and maintenance, capital expenditures, that type of stuff. And library supplies, subscriptions are always changing with technology, new programs.
Okay, so the other departments, the ones you mentioned, you give reports to. So it's not that their budgets or their forecasts aren't changing, it's just not a major variable that's going to really impact the overall forecast.
Right, yeah, I mean, if you take, for example, the registrar's office, it's really just all payroll. Other than that, there might be some supplies, there might be a conference or two, but generally speaking, some of those cost centers, they really don't have a lot of activity other than payroll, which is pretty, it's fixed.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So let's kind of move on a little bit to what it was like prior to Budget Pack. I know you used Excel for budgeting, forecasting, and your reporting. Can you give us some insight about how it worked prior to using Budget Pack? So like who was involved, how long did it take, what issues with Excel did you encounter?
With Excel, it was pretty much a manual process. We usually had 3 of us from the finance area sit down and try to put it all into Excel. We had one spreadsheet for revenue based on all those programs, number of credits. We had a spreadsheet that tracked payroll, expenses, and benefits. And then we had a separate spreadsheet that would track your other expenses, supplies, and telephone, that type of stuff, utilities. And what you have to do is merge them together all into one spreadsheet. And as you know, one bad click or one bad formula messes the whole forecast up. And not only that, but when you're growing like this and you're adding new programs, you're continually adding new accounts. Anytime you add a new account, your template that you made in Excel changes. So then you have to update that spreadsheet. It causes too many errors, and you didn't have any good controls over the system.
Okay, and I think you also spoke about just being able to answer the questions that were coming from the board or senior management. How did you figure out what was happening? How were you able to answer questions, or were you?
Well, it was very difficult. Even we generally do about 4 to 6 forecasts during the year. We try to do one at least every other month, if not monthly. And you'd always kind of go back to the last forecast and say, oh, why did we put that number in there? That didn't make any sense. You didn't have any notes. You might have put a note in there. You might have had a formula in that cell, but you kind of didn't have a good way of tracking what was that expense for. And then at the end, you had a system that just kind of rolled it all in. You couldn't really look at the details.
Mm-hmm. And did you involve your the staff at all? Were they involved looking at reports, or did they have input into it? How did that work?
We would give them reports in Excel, after a forecast like we do now, but they weren't nice looking reports. It took us a long time to generate them. They didn't mean as much. It was kind of just budget to actual, really. And now we can create a report that says, here were your last year's numbers. This was your budget. Here are your actuals to date. And then, here's what we're forecasting for the end of the year. And they can use that to manage their budget.
Okay. So I imagine that for the folks on the call, a lot of the issues with Excel are issues that they've probably experienced since these are sort of classic issues when you're working with a tool that's not necessarily designed to do what you want it to do. There's a lot of time and energy and errors that can come out of it. And so,
right. And
go ahead, Dan.
I was also going to say that when we sat down and did the forecast in Excel, we'd print all the information from the accounting system. We'd print the last forecast. We'd have the budget. We'd have all these pieces of paper on the table, and you try to come up with what you thought was going to be the most accurate. Well, now you have it all in the system. When you're on that, you're into the registrar's office and you're looking at conferences. By looking at one screen what the last forecast had, what last year's actuals are. You import the fiscal numbers to date. You have all that information without tracking it all in all these pieces of paper and spreadsheets. It's really a good control.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and that sort of segues into what you thought the top challenges with Excel were, particularly when thinking about the forecasting issue. So those four issues, even though you said that you weren't really worried too much about the variances in payroll during the forecast, even that said, 70% of your costs are payroll related, so it was a priority to deal with during the forecasting process.
Right, yeah. So the system allows you to have a sheet of all employees in there, what their salary is, what their FTE is, what their position is. And when you go through the budget process, you can give percent raises. It's all in the system rather than tracking it in Excel. And like I said, you don't know exactly what the final numbers are going to be for a forecast, but you have all those numbers in for the budget. It's all in the system. You don't have to go back and look at your Excel spreadsheets.
So if we could talk about just kind of what happened before Budget Pack with Excel, just focus on Excel for a little bit. One of the issues were the lack of formal review process. Could you describe what you mean by the review process and why that was so cumbersome with Excel?
Right. So you'd roll up all those spreadsheets together, and you would come up with, okay, here's the total for academic administration, but what's the total within that cost center? How much have they spent on supplies versus the last forecast? Or how much have we spent on supplies in total across all departments? You really can't do that with Excel. You sort of roll it all up, and you can't drill down to the different accounts. But with this system, you're able to drill down and create reports easily enough without manually doing it yourself.
Okay. All right. So let's move on to kind of the stakeholders. So what do the stakeholders need when they're working with the forecasting process? So we know that there are many stakeholders to consider in both budget and forecasting. And the three main stakeholders typically are the department heads, the senior management, and then finance. And so each of these usually has different needs in the process and probably different complaints about, what they have to do and the tools they have to use and what they need to get out of it. So let's start with you, Dan, the finance team. What were your needs when you looked for a solution, and what complaints did you have about the forecasting process at that point?
Well, and one, first of all, it took way too long. The forecasting, a total forecast in Excel would take about 3 days to complete. It was just a tremendous headache. And when you were done, you really didn't know if you had accurate numbers in there. You you didn't have time to go back and do a detailed review. You didn't know if you had a formula error in there. It's really you just couldn't, you didn't have good controls over the system, and to go back and create a report out of something you created in Excel was impossible to do. So now you have a system that controls it. It has all your employee data. You can go back and look at notes that you put in the system, and you can create reports and drill down to the areas you'd like to look at.
Okay. And could you talk a little bit about the revenue calculations in the system? Because you felt that that was one of the things that was really missing from Excel, but that yet it was really important to be able to control during your forecast.
Right. So, we don't know exactly what our enrollment is going to be, and we can create that. We can create a formula in the system that multiplies the annual tuition by the number of students, and that way you really have a control in the system rather than going back to Excel, making all these spreadsheets on how many students are going to be there and what the price is going to be and then what attrition is going to be. Now you have that, the formulas right there in the system.
And the detailed employee data, I know that you're really using that more when you start off your budget process, but that was the other thing that you felt was really lacking in Excel but was critical for you to be able to have an accurate forecast.
Right, yeah. So we had all our employees in Excel, and you really had no way to sort of track, raises or, things were going to change during the year. People were going to be, people were going to retire, or you're going to hire new people. And with the system, you can put in, we're going to start this employee on October 1st. Their salary is going to be this amount, and the system automatically calculates how much that impact it will have on your budget year, and if you know what your percentage of benefits is, you can add that to the system, so it automatically calculates your payroll taxes are added onto it and your benefit rate too.
Okay, so you really, from finance, were really looking at sort of the nitty-gritty details, whereas when we think about it in terms of your budget managers, they were looking for something sort of different in terms of the forecasting system. Those 2 points were the points that we talked about. So could you just mention what was their needs in working with a forecasting solution?
Yeah, so our budget managers aren't necessarily the most savvy at finance and Excel. We would send them reports in Excel to create a budget, or we would send them reports on how they were doing during the year, and they're academics. They have trouble using Excel. That often write down numbers and hand it back to you. And we wanted a system that budget users could go in, create their own budget, would walk you through the system. It's kind of like a TurboTax for budgeting, and it's great for people who aren't great with technology. It kind of walks you through it. You can add a % increase from last year, or you can do a decrease, or it kind of walks you through and does the calculations for you. Or if someone's advanced, they can sort of bypass that step and put the numbers in themselves.
Okay. And then we have the third group of the stakeholders, the senior management or the board, and they typically want different things out of the system. They're often more hands-off, but yet they want to make sure that certain things are going to happen in the budgeting and forecasting process. So could you talk about what their concerns were in the current process and why a solution was something they were looking for as well?
Yeah, I think we with the debt compliance that we have to monitor, I think they were happy that we'd have a system that could control the budget information. We'd have a system that could control the forecasts. We actually showed the system at one of our finance committee meetings, and they were really impressed with, they were comfortable with a system that they know they could rely on. And then if they have a question, with the click of a button, I can come up with that number rather than kind of go back and manually calculate it based on an Excel spreadsheet or general ledger detail or something like that.
So that was the piece, the reporting by multiple variables that you're talking about, that you'd be able to kind of answer their questions and be able to drill into the data by the various points so that they could get their information quickly.
Right. Yeah. If someone asks you a question, I want to know how much you spent on memberships for these two cost centers only, you can produce that report. Or if you want to know how much we spent on work study, for all programs, then you have that information. Or if you just want to know how much you spent in total on, you can do it any way you want. Any cost centers, general ledger accounts, you just click the button and the report. You can compare last year's versus this year's data, or your budget to your forecast.
Okay, so we have these three groups, and they're all sort of coming at things from their own unique perspective. But usually there's somebody who's instigating this whole thing. So who's the instigator? Who wanted to change most? You, your department heads, or your senior managers?
It was definitely us. That we decided, hey, we're getting kind of big to be calculating all these budgets in Excel, and you have all these different spreadsheets going, and we kind of said, someone's going to make an error, and we're going to be at fault, and the board's really going to be unhappy with us. And it's the time alone to take to run a forecast, about 3 days. Now we can do a forecast in about 3 hours. Just the time alone was huge. Our budget users, that was kind of secondary. They're very happy with the system. But finance, we really needed something that could really control the data and make us feel like we have the right numbers in the system.
And actually, I think we just kind of segued into this. This is what you're really looking for: the secure and accurate data to control the processes, quick actions, quick access to those answers. So why were people putting a certain amount in? What was the justification? Ease of use for both finance and users, and then the time savings.
That's right.
Anything
Yeah.
you want to add?
I wanted to add that when the first thing to do when you create a forecast, we download the actuals to date from our accounting system and import it into BudgetPack. It's very simple, and then you have a record of what your actuals are to date, and you can compare that without even running a forecast to maybe the actuals to date 2 months ago. We've even used some of those reports for audit purposes because you can manipulate the data and get the answers that the auditors are looking for as well.
So there were a lot of pieces you probably even found once you started using the system that there were other benefits that you didn't even think about, which we'll probably get to a little bit further on in the webinar. So, okay. So what was the process that you took to investigate software solutions?
We actually, we didn't really know we were going to buy a system. We kind of said, well, let's start looking. It was kind of, right before we started the budget process. It was probably, in October, we decided, hey, let's take a look. And I called some peer schools, and one of them said, hey, I found this system called BudgetPack. I said, well, let's take a look at them. And basically, we went from there and said, can we get the system up and running quickly, because we're really going to be starting with our budget meetings any day now. And we had the system up and running in a couple of weeks. Basically, you just have to have, download your reports from your accounting system in your chart of accounts, and it was a very easy transition process.
Yeah, I think your implementation took all of 3 weeks.
It was
but you were very highly motivated, Dan, as well.
Yes. Yes. As long as you can download the reports from your system, it's very easy to set up. Okay.
So a little bit about how you got approval to buy the system. So most, people you talk to, and even you said, it wasn't really kind of, we're looking around and maybe we'd find something and maybe we wouldn't. And most people don't have a current budget. So what happened? How did you get this through the approval process?
Yeah, there was no budget during the year for a budget system. We kind of did it on the fly. But we loved the fact that not only could the system help us with budgeting for finance and our department users and all the reporting, but then you have a forecasting solution that we could use throughout the year. It wasn't just a one-time use. And we just knew that just the time savings alone and the fact that you didn't have any errors from data entry or formulas, that the time would outweigh the cost of the system.
Mm-hmm. So there's always money in the budget somewhere, I guess.
There is, yeah.
Okay, so let's move actually to my favorite slide. This is my most favorite conversation I had with you when we were talking about this webinar. That you told me that flexibility was critical to you in the forecasting process. And typically, organizations use one of two methods for forecasting. Either they merge the actuals and budget and keep the totals the same as the budget. So don't change my budget, that's my budget, just kind of merge my actuals in. Or you want to put those actuals and budgets together, but adjust the totals based upon the actuals, so what happened in reality. Yet you tell me you actually use both of these methods in the forecasting process, as well as a third one, which is ignore them altogether and enter a new total. So can you talk about those three methods that you use and when you would use each of them?
Mm-hmm. So depending on the account and the situation, we actually use all three of these. We have the numbers up in the screen. We have prior year numbers, we have actuals to date, we have our budget numbers, and then we have our last forecast numbers. We're using all four variables to decide what's the number going to be at the end of the year. And in some cases, we say, no, we budgeted for $10,000 for this expense, we're holding them to it, that's what the number is going to be at the end of the year. We're going to make sure we monitor that budget. 10,000 is the budget number. We're sticking to that number. In some cases, if it's a utilities expense, and we say, oh wow, we budgeted $30,000 for electricity, but we're spending $4,000 a month. We're on pace for 48. We've got to make that adjustment, and we use the actuals to date to kind of project that forecasted number at the end of the year. And in some cases, you might say, oh wow, we budgeted for $30,000. Our forecast was $40,000, but we just signed that contract. It's going to cost us $50,000. So I'm not even going to consider any of those numbers. I know the number is going to be 50, and you just put $50,000 in for the final forecasted number at the end of the year.
So that's actually quite flexible, but you really have to know your business as well. So you talked about the major spenders and the variables, and you're getting down to the account level detail by department really, and thinking about what's the best way to forecast each of those pieces.
Yeah, oftentimes you go through a forecast and you say, oh wow, I don't know the answer to that. You call somebody up, but you do have to get the major cost centers, the major variables, the plant maintenance, marketing, IT, library, and then some of the other alternative revenue sources. Those are the ones you really have to keep an eye on and keep in contact with and say, what's the number going to be?
Mm-hmm. So those are the ones you're focused on first during the forecasting process, and then you sort of eyeball the rest of them?
Right. So most of the other ones, you sort of kind of rely on the budget for that. But in some cases, things change all the time. In a school like this where we're growing, there's many changes throughout the year.
And so kind of moving to the next slide, you actually give the budget holders. The budget holders really can now easily see their initial budget versus the actuals, forecast versus budget, and forecast versus actuals, so that they can also tell you when something is out of whack. Is that correct?
Yeah, so when we go through, after finishing a forecast, we will download reports from the system and send it out to each department head. We have about 22 cost centers, and oftentimes we're talking to them anyways, but just in case, we'll say, hey, here it is. Can you let us know if anything's off here? You're responsible for monitoring your budget. Sometimes we modify that budget, and the forecast supersedes it, but we want to make sure that the information's in front of them, and they have that, and expect them to get back to us with any significant changes.
And you talked a little while ago that you do about 4 to 6 forecasts a year. And so during each of those processes, does it get sort of kind of simpler and more straightforward as you get towards the end of that forecasting cycle?
Yeah, I mean, as time goes on through the year, you have fewer unknowns as we get later in the year. Although here we are at the end of March, we have 2 months left, and We just had our Finance Committee meeting a few weeks ago. I said, there's kind of still a lot of unknowns, even with 2 months left during the year. But we always do a forecast before every Finance Committee, if not 2 in between those meetings.
So that's a lot. And then you're probably just about getting ready to gear up for your budget as well at this point.
Well, yeah, next year's budget was already approved in January. So we're actually working on, we're looking at the current year budget as well as forecasting a number for the end of the year. And also we have our next year's budget already, in place. And oftentimes, we'll look at all 3 numbers, throughout the year and sort of monitor the activity.
Mm-hmm. So do you use the current forecast to help you with your upcoming budget?
It's actually the first thing we did after we had our budget meetings, mostly in November. In December, we ended up doing another forecast on this current fiscal year and said, well, this is really our best estimate going forward. And we used a lot of those numbers to create next year's budget.
I think so. Instead of starting from scratch with a budget that might be 12 to 18 months old, when you start your new budget, you're really working with the freshest numbers and information possible to come up with a really solid budget for the upcoming year.
Right. That's exactly it. Oftentimes the budget that you created last year, was so far, so long ago that things have changed so much. You have to rely on the current forecast.
Mm-hmm. Right. So let's move into the benefits. So you mentioned 5 top benefits of using BudgetPack for forecasting. You mentioned speed, control, flexibility, reporting, and ease of use. So could you just discuss each of them and just provide an example for each one?
Okay, yeah. Obviously, the best benefit that we find is it saves so much time to go through the manual process of 3 days of Excel spreadsheets, all this paper that we're looking at. You can do a forecast in a matter of 3 hours. It's a huge change from the old process. And when you're done with it, you have that you have the controls in place. The system is calculating all your numbers, so there's no formula errors, there's no data errors, and you can put in notes, so you can go back and find out, oh, why did we choose that number? That doesn't seem right. So you have the controls in place from that aspect. And like we talked about before, the flexibility of looking at actuals, budgets, previous forecasts, even the next year's budget. You have all this information in front of you, and the system will allow you to choose, percentage increase or hold to the budget, that type of stuff. It's very flexible. And then when you're done with that forecast, you can choose any way you want to kind of manipulate, all the activity. You can choose different accounts, different cost centers. You manipulate the data any way you want. You'd never be able to do that with the old system and create reports on how you're doing throughout the year. And the system is very easy to use. We find that you download the actuals data from our accounting system, you put it into the system, and you fly right through it, cost center by cost center.
Okay, excellent. So in wrapping up, actually, we thought it would be sort of interesting and also important to leave all of you on the call with some food for thought. So we have a number of questions, and Dan and I'll ask the question, and then if you would give your insight into why each question is something everyone should be asking themselves. So if you would answer the question in terms of what people should be looking for, I think that would be most helpful to everyone. All right, so here's the first food for thought question. If you're not doing a forecast, how do you know how you're doing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You really should know what your forecasted bottom line is going to be at the end of the year. If you're really just sort of monitoring the budget versus actuals to date, how are you compiling a forecasted surplus at the end of the year? You kind of need to know that for your board or for your banks, and you need to monitor that progress throughout the year. I don't know how you would do it unless, if you weren't creating forecasts throughout the year.
Okay, next food for thought question. Can you easily answer questions from your board or finance committee?
Yeah, so you can drill down reporting through the system very easily. And every system, you should be allowed to go back and sort of, answer any questions that come from, the finance committee or the board or even, the president. The president's always asking, questions about, how much should we spend on this and that. You should have a system that you can generate that information with a couple clicks of a button.
I think maybe, the other thing I was thinking about when you were saying that was, how quickly can you answer questions? So easily sort of relates to the quickness as well. Where do you want to spend your time? Do you want to spend your time doing analysis? Did you want to spend your time going through Excel spreadsheets and trying to figure out what the answer is?
Yeah, that's a great point. You don't want to spend your time, running 3 different reports from your accounting system, and then you didn't have time to really analyze what that final data is and what that means to the organization. And now you have time to generate that number and then say, oh wow, that seems off, and that's why he's asking that question.
Okay. So next food for thought question. Can you easily monitor every single department down to the account level to make sure you are strategically managing your business?
Yeah, and if you're not really able to do that, then you're really not monitoring the activity throughout the year. You should be able to go in to your system and manipulate the data as much as possible, and not only to look at the data for the current year, but you should be able to compare that data to previous forecasts or previous fiscal years or actuals to date from the previous year.
Mm-hmm. I think that would be sort of especially helpful, Dan, if you're creating a new program. Saying, I know you've expanded greatly in your school, and you're looking at what's the typical kind of startup, rate for a new program. You can look back into history and see what that was. That might help you inform your revenue projections for this year.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, that's also a good point. Now we have a system that once we have the actuals in the system, we can very easily create reports to find out what that activity looked like, from 3 or 4 years ago, and be able to manipulate that data within the fiscal year. In our current accounting system, you kind of have the reports that are tailored on there already, and you can't really manipulate the data as well as you can with this reporting system.
Okay, so next question our listeners should be thinking about is how do you want to engage your budget managers in the budgeting and forecasting process?
Yeah, you really want to get them involved. I mean, if they're not involved, then you don't know what's going on, and you can't monitor the progress of the budget or the forecast. You really want to get them involved with creating their budget, monitoring it throughout the year, forecasting what the expense is going to be at the end of the year or the revenue, and hold them accountable. Get them involved and make them feel like it's their budget and they have control over it.
Okay. And one final food for thought question that the listeners should be asking themselves is, what are the potential time savings and accuracy improvements versus the cost of buying a dedicated solution?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, everyone should have a system where they can control it, control the activity, feel like they have accurate numbers. You should be able to, you should have a system that can save you the time. If you think about the 3 days of time, my time, the other people in the finance time, we get our CFO involved, we review it with the president. Think about all that time you spent creating that forecast. You could have spent all that time doing something else if you had a system that could produce a forecast in 3 hours versus 3 days.
All righty. Okay, thank you, Dan. I'll let you just take a little breather, get a drink of water or something while just before we get to the question. So as we let kind of the people on the call ponder their own answers to the questions, and before we get to the questions that people submitted, I just want to provide some useful links so that folks could get more information about Accelerant and Budget Pack. So we will be contacting those of you on the call to learn more about your forecasting and budgeting needs and see how we can help. Please check out our blogs, our recent blog post. Actual results may vary, the art of forecasting. You might find very interesting, particularly in light of this webinar. And if you subscribe to our blog, it'll keep you up to date on our perspectives on the budgeting industry. You can always reach us at info@accelerant.com to find out more about our cloud-based budgeting, forecasting, and management reporting solution. So we'll move now. We have about 8 minutes or so left. We'll move on to the questions from the audience. We'll cover as many as we can, and if we don't answer yours today, someone from Accelerant will certainly contact you to follow up. All right, Dan, you're back on the hot seat again for questions.
Okay.
All right, so first question, what surprised you most about the implementation of the software?
Definitely, it was how quick and easy it was to implement. You know, like I said, we looked at the system in probably early October, and you know, probably decided it late in October, and we had the system up and running by Thanksgiving, and we were kind of saying, well, it's kind of too late for this year. Let's not do it. And my assistant controller kind of said, no, let's go for it. Let's get this system up and running here. And it was very quick and easy. As long as you can get your chart of accounts and your actuals out of the system, it's pretty easy to set up.
Okay, and sort of a follow-up question from that. So if you could kind of you said it's very easy to set up. How easy is it to upload data to and from your accounting system into BudgetPack?
Yeah, very easy. Every forecast, we will download the actuals to date. Once you have a template set up from your accounting system, you use the same one, and you basically click import in the system and from Excel, and it pops right into to BudgetPack. It's very easy. And to get information out, we don't transfer any information out of BudgetPack into the system, but it's very easy to create a report and download it into Excel or PDF from BudgetPack.
Okay, and how often are you bringing actuals into the system?
Probably 6 times a year every time we do a forecast, and then the final numbers will go in there as well if we want to run reports.
Okay. And did you need your IT staff to get involved at all?
Other than the implementation, setting the system up at the very beginning, I don't think I've involved IT at all since the system was installed.
Okay, and you originally had the client-server version, so that did involve IT. But now in moving to the cloud, your IT isn't involved at all.
IT isn't right. Involved at all. I'm not even sure if they were much before that anyways.
Right.
But now the system is web-based, which is great because I can access the data anywhere, from home or I'm out on the road. Prior to that, you'd have to log into the VPN and get access. Mm-hmm. So it's much faster through the cloud.
And you didn't even need your IT staff to help you get data from your general ledger system, correct?
No, we did talk to our accounting software to just say, oh, what report should we use here? And it was very simple. As long as you have the information by month into Excel, it's very easy.
Okay. Question from the audience. Are budget managers able to play with forecast models for their departments using the system?
Yes, you can get them involved with forecasting and have them log in and create a forecast during the year if you would like, or change numbers to it. We haven't involved budget users with the system during the forecasting process. We've done it during the budget process. But we usually just ask them for their input, and then we plug in the numbers ourselves. But you could do it.
Mm-hmm. Right, and there's also the what-if scenario. I'm not sure, Dan, if you've taken advantage of that in the system, but there's a what-if component within BudgetPack that lets you what-if against your budgets and your forecast to Trump scenarios.
Yeah, so it kind of walks you through. It says what if, and then you can choose. Oh, if it's this circumstance, we're going to use the actuals. If it's this circumstance, we're going to add a percentage onto that. So it makes it easy for even a budget departments that really aren't that savvy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is a question I can probably answer is, do you house the data on your servers or on the Accelerants server hosting? So we, all of our clients are hosting in the cloud through our cloud vendor. So that's, just wanted to get that out of the way. So you're not housing the data on our servers. That was the old client server version of BudgetPack, which we've moved to the cloud, so everything is up in our hosted solution. Okay, here's a question, Dan, I'm not sure if you want to just take a stab at this. At what revenue size should a company convert from an Excel budget or forecast to a cloud-based system?
Honestly, I don't know if the revenue size really matters unless you can, keep track of your budgets and your forecasts in Excel, very easily, and you have, just a couple different cost centers. You really, need a system that can control it. So, I mean, really, as small as, small organizations could really benefit from this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we sort of mentioned that, early on, that you felt that you were too big for Excel, and yet some organizations might look at you as a small organization. Yet, you're like,
no question.
We're too big for Excel. Yeah.
That's right. I mean,
yeah.
we're only 21 million. We're in annual, budget, we're very small. But when you have, 20 plus different cost centers that you're trying to track in Excel with all these different department heads, it's too many people and too much information involved.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Here's a question also from the audience, and just kind of, and I'll generalize it a little bit, is why is this better than using your general ledger for budgeting or forecasting? And you don't have to mention your GL system here, Dan,
right.
But just in general, why would looking for a focused budgeting solution be better than going with what your GL vendor provides?
Yeah, that's a really good question. But yeah, our system really isn't capable of anything close that BudgetPack can handle. Basically, we would create our budget in Excel, upload it into the system, but that was generally it. We might look at budget to actual reports throughout the year, but that was generally the extent of it. You really couldn't manipulate the data or put in employees or revenue or anything like that, and certainly not create a forecast.
Right. Okay. All right, we'll take two more questions. Someone is wondering if they can get a copy of the presentation slides, and are we recording the webinar? Yes, we actually are recording the webinar, and for those of you on the call, you'll get a link to that so you can review it again at your leisure. And so the final question for you, Dan, from the audience asked about that you mentioned creating a report that included last year's numbers and actuals to date. How often are you able to generate this report?
Last year's numbers versus.
So I think that would
actuals.
be so actuals. I don't know whether she means budget and actuals. So you created a report. You talked about a lot of comparison reports where you could look at last year's actuals and current budget and forecast versus last year's actuals.
Yeah, I mean, you really can do it as often as you want. If you really wanted to, and I bet a lot of organizations do this, you could download the data from your accounting system, import it into BudgetPack, and compare month to month versus last year. If you wanted to do that, it's actually a good idea.
Yeah. There you go. Everyone's getting something out of this webinar.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Dan, if there's anything else you want to add, or I'll wrap up?
No, I just think just like I said, the time savings of having a system that can control your data and is just really outweighs the cost, and is really a good purchase of ours. We love the system.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dan. So I really want to thank you for taking the time, not only today, but our other sessions that we had just in talking about your process. It was really informative to me. You're very engaging and informative. I'm sure that our listeners on the call are walking away with at least one nugget of information, if not more, as to how they should be looking at their forecasting process and maybe begin to make some positive changes in the way that they do things. So I mentioned again that the webinar has been recorded. We'll be happy to send you a link you can share with your team. And for more information on our company, please visit Accelerant.com. So thank you all so much for attending, and have a very pleasant rest of your afternoon. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.